Do you want to go down that way? It's sort of like shade on the around the path, or you can do it on the path. You've got cross if you want.
I'll be quiet at the green.
Yes, if you want, we can cut across directly.
Yeah.
How's that?
Yeah.
Ciao, I'm Michele Acuto.
And I'm Caitlin Morrissey.
And welcome to the mini-series Walking the City With, hosted by the Urban Studies podcast. This series is all about the people behind the ideas in urban research. We get them out of the lecture room, their books, their articles, to literally walk the talk with the authors and editors in urban studies. And this series is a bit of a world first for urbanists, or at least for urban scholars, in that it's actually peer-reviewed as a podcast. So hopefully the content is real good and has been double-checked at least twice. What we're in for this time, Caitlin?
Well, we're actually in the privileged position in this episode of hearing from two scholars who, together, trace for us a nearly 6-decade arc of urban spatial analytics.
And that level of reflection is why we have Caitlin for post-walk analysis back in the studio, almost like the best of the football podcast pundits.
Is coming home. In the mini-series, we are putting the spotlight or the microphone on how they are doing global urbanism by getting out there in the streets of cities around the world.
This time, two scholars at the podcast price of one, by the way. So we went out with Zara Shabrina and Mike Batty. Zara is at King's College London and Mike is at University College London. And we walked them in Green Park in London. So buckets of local expertise here.
And in this episode, we are talking with them about platform economies, Airbnb misuse, and the evolution of spatial analytics.
So how did they get into urban studies?
Let's hear from Zara and Mike, shall we?
Yeah, let's go.
I'm going to walk in the middle of you.
Okay.
Do you want to get us started? Do you want to...
So I got into urban studies quite early because I did my undergrad, my bachelor degree as well as master degree in urban planning. But I think it has started even before that because I have always been quite curious in terms of like how the cities work. I've been living in cities my whole life. And I find that cities as this purposely constructed environments, it's quite fascinating. You have all these different elements on top of one another. And then it's quite complex. As Mike could put it might be like the complexities of cities. So you have all these elements, you have this housing, you have the road network, you have the buildings, architecture, you have all different kind of things. On top of, there is set of people that are really like the heterogeneity is quite high. So they are very diverse. So I feel like cities are quite fascinating to be studied at. And yeah, I think I just find it quite fascinating.
Right, yours, Mike. How do you get into urban, whatever you want to call it?
Urban studies, well, it's always been with me, urban studies, because I actually studied architecture and planning in the 1960s. So I was trained in that tradition, and urban studies was just beginning then. And the earliest memories I have are the meeting when I was a graduate student, held here in Covent Garden. The Covent Garden redevelopment scheme was going on. The old fruit market farm market had disappeared, and they were redeveloping it. And there's a team which was located in the Strand, and there was a guy called Ralph Rookwood who basically set up this seminar, and I was a student in Manchester then, and basically at that meeting, urban studies was sort of in the air. It wasn't called urban studies, but it was quite clearly much broader than architecture and planning. That was the first point. And at the meeting, there was a woman called Ruth Glass, I remember quite vividly, who ran the Centre for Urban Studies at UCL. And she's one of the doyens of segregation and these sorts of things, housing in cities. Mike Edwards at UCL knew her quite well. So I met Ruth Glass then. So urban studies has sort of always been with me in that sense. And then people began to put things together in an interdisciplinary fashion. And they were people not from architectural planning, they were from a whole variety of subjects. Urban economics, Harry Richardson, for example, was key. Ray Parle, who was at the LSE, was a sociologist. And so that's really where it all came from. And then, of course, it exploded as more and more disciplines began to think about cities, basically. And these people, these academics were, and practitioners for that matter, were not necessarily planners as such, but there were people interested in cities and also interested in planning too, of course.
So back in the studio, Caitlin, what do you make of that?
Well, it was really interesting to hear both Zara and Mike's trajectories into urban studies. And we heard from Mike about a kind of lineage of urban studies from his vantage point of being a student in the 60s in Manchester and in London. But what was interesting about Mike's reflections were his observations of the intersectional analysis that was beginning to emerge, the debates beginning to happen and coalesce around issues facing cities as a territory or space of analysis. And then from Zara, what was really interesting was hearing about how her interest in urban spatial analytics seemed to sort of stem from these personal experiences of living in cities and a curiosity and fascination about all of these elements that make up the urban kind of come to be and why they're there. And I think that's something that a lot of us will have in common.
100%. And I think what they have in common as urban scientists, if they call themselves that, is in a sense the fascination and the critical eye for that complexity and working with the idea of complexity and complexity sciences. So at that point, I sort of just threw it back to them and trying to understand, how do you tackle complexity? How do you unpack something as wide and complicated as that? So that's what I asked then right after that to Zara and Mike.
Okay, Robert. So before answering that, I think it's important to understand what platform economy is. And platform economy, we use it to describe the kind of activities. It could be social activities, it could be business activities, anything that are facilitated by a platform. So that could encompass lots of different things. And what it is, it relies on the existence of the internet and algorithms, computation, this big data set, and a set of users. And so it has become quite an indispensable part of our urban life as we live in this digital age, right? So, for example, we have things such as Uber, and then with their ride-hailing services disrupt transport industries, and we have Airbnb, which is the focus of my research, which disrupts housing. So in terms of looking at platform economy, because it's how big it is as a concept, we need to try to tackle it one by one, because every platform is very different. And so if we want to try to understand them, we need to understand them individually. And that's why I studied Airbnb in terms of how it works, and then we might be using it in terms of the spatial distributions, the relationship with the urban system, urban tourism, and the relationship with different urban elements as well. And it's something that are happened differently in different regions. So even just one platform, you have to dissect it into a different set of things. So it could be very different because they are located differently in different geographical region. It could be urban, it could be rural, it could be in the seaside, and so on. And so, and it's different as well because then the elements surrounding Airbnb might be different as well. So in terms of platform economy itself, I think in a sense, we need to be able to understand them from the ground up. So then we look at it individually for each platform, and then we look at it granularly in terms of the specific locations and things like that. And we can't really take a conclusion that this kind of platform economy works in this one city, but not in the other city. It's just very different.
The inspiration for this conversation was a piece of work that Zara and Mike recently published in Urban Studies called Airbnb and its Potential Impact on the London Housing Market. So we asked them to tell us a little bit more about what that term means in their work.
We're trying to understand the impact of the Airbnb platform on housing in London. The main question is that whether Airbnb is an additional contributor to the housing crisis in London. However, we acknowledge that Airbnb as a platform, they offer different kind of listings, right? They offer the kind of listings that are private rooms, shared rooms in which the hosts are located in the property. They are in the property. So this kind of listings, they're not really problematic. Or it's an entire house listing. However, it's being used when the owner or like the host is abroad or on holiday. So this kind of thing is not problematic. So when we try to understand the potential impact of Airbnb, we need to try to understand what kind of activities might contribute to the worsening of the housing crisis. And that's when we come up with the term Airbnb misuse. So the Airbnb misuse are the Airbnb listings that are offered as entire home property. So these properties are listed, but they do not conform to the local regulation. So for example, in London, you can't really rent your home for more than 90 days annually as a holiday rental. And so we try to look at, can we try to separate the listings that are being advertised more than, in this case, 180 days? Because if we assume that these listings are being booked for at least 50% out of the time, then it will go beyond the 90 days regulation, right? So then we look into this kind of listings, we separate them, and then we also separate the listings in which the hosts have multiple listings. It just means that they have multiple properties being advertised through Airbnb for a long period of time. And so this type of housing are being retracted from the housing market, and it cannot longer be used as for long-term tenants. And based on our study, we could see that this kind of listings, the Airbnb misuse, accounts for around 0.16% of the overall housing market. So there are around, based on the valuation office agency, there are around 3.4 million housing in London, and around 5,300 of them are Airbnb misuse. It doesn't seem like a big number, but then when we map them out, it's very highly concentrated in some areas only. And this uneven distribution actually put a pressure towards the housing market unevenly. So only in certain areas, mostly prime areas, so for example, Camden, Westminster, Hatna E, which are growing areas. And these areas are also sometimes areas that are currently gentrifying. And so we feel that it's important to use the term misuse to be able to filter out this kind of Airbnb. And we also find correlation with areas that with high private rented properties. And it is also problematic because it's the second largest tenure in London. And it's also the least type of tenure because you're not really protected if you're in the private rented market. So yeah, we feel like we do have some well-grounded evidence in terms of looking at that Airbnb misuse could be problematic in a city like as London, in which housing is highly stressed.
It was really interesting to hear their thoughts about how their work could be used and by who, noting that with an issue as complex as housing, there's not only one authority or actor that could take these findings and apply them, but reflecting more broadly on the use of analytical tools and how far they can be used to predict change in cities. Mike explained how in a post-COVID world, where the pandemic produced this unexpected global shock to the rhythms of everyday life, certainty about predictive models is beginning to loosen, and this has really clear implications for the way that cities are being planned and developed in the future. Back to Mike.
Yeah, well, a note about the platform economy first. The term platform goes back a long way. I mean, with the PC revolution, which really began probably in the late 70s, early 80s, with Apple II and then the IBM PC and so on. The term platform was used to some extent then. As soon as we began to get networking, the term platform began to be used. And of course, generically now, to some extent, everywhere we look in society, in modern society, we've got platforms of various kinds. And as Zara said, the internet is really pretty central to the operation of the platform economy or platform economies, largely because platform economies are based on linking different activities and people and tasks and so on together in that sense. In terms of the use of tools to study the platform economy, to study the city, if you like, in this sense, digital tools and so on, then my specialism is in building computer models, really has been for many years, of cities in this sense. And indeed, in looking with Zara at Airbnb, basically, then to some extent, a lot of her work on this has been developing different models and so on. But you asked specifically the question about prediction and the digital transformation and so on. I mean, one of the kind of key issues in terms of thinking about the impact of computation on cities, and this relates to many of the theories and ideas that we have about cities, then essentially, I think we're rapidly coming to the conclusion that it's pretty impossible to predict anything. The idea of scientific prediction in the classical sense is very much now on the back burner in some sense, because as soon as you involve human beings, and that's everything from the economy to weather forecasting and so on, then you have the human in the loop in that sense. So to some extent, the idea of prediction is quite problematic.
Super. And I'm going to ask you the question of practice, theory and practice. So I guess the question is, so you look through something like that, you realize that you found something, but how do you embed what is, unless to an outsider, really complex scientific reasoning, how do you embed that into planning practice, everyday practice? How do you embed it into discussions that are maybe, I don't know, critical social science that doesn't do that? How do you bring it in?
Well, many of these tools are being used, as it were, through the back door, really, in that sense. One of the issues we've been particularly concerned in is the kind of database that is available with respect to planning and cities, and that's planning applications. This enormous database going back, 50 or more years of every planning application in Britain with the decisions and so on. And that database can give you a unique view of what's actually happening in cities, but of course it's not exploited. Really, we're not able to do much about it because there is no national authority controlling that data. It's used purely for the bureaucratic purposes of deciding on a planning application, permissions in that sense. So in other words, it's a gloomy-ish story in one sense, because there's a lot of tools that are there, but they're not being used. And if we turn it back to what we were doing on Airbnb, I think what Zara did in her thesis was to demonstrate the power of Airbnb in terms of how one could begin to systematically model the impact of this in terms of location and housing in that particular context. And arguably, the impact on practice would be in terms of individuals mental alligators disease, picking up those arguments and developing the ideas about platform economies and interfacing that with the housing affordability crisis, the whole crisis of housing in big cities like London. And in some senses, there isn't any specific agency who are tasked with doing that, although local authorities are very well geared to beginning to think about it and do think about it in a sense. Have to think about it by law in that sense to deal with the housing crisis. So in some senses, this is not all bad news. It's good news in the sense that studies such as the one that Zara and ourselves at UCL have done is relevant to thinking about the wider question of housing affordability.
quite glad that it wasn't all doom and gloom, and that even in that story of the misuse of the platform economies, there was some silver lining here. A little bit like with Colin McFarlane, there was some concerns, but we got into some optimism as well, don't you think?
Yes, and thank goodness for that.
The interesting thing was that I also felt a common thread throughout the series has been the conversation about speaking, not just walking, global urbanism. And then I thought, I have these incredible scholars or urban scientists, as I would define them, complexity scientists, doing some incredible things with computers. And I sort of just thought, maybe I should ask them about how they talk to computers, a bit like we spoke to Julie Wren about different languages, or Sergio Montero or Colin McFarlane about using different languages. And I thought, what about machine language? Now, just before I did that, I almost pushed them into a bike lane. So beware, here it's where it gets dangerous.
It's just,
I think this is a bike lane.
it is a bike lane, isn't it? Did we just walk into a bike lane? Yes. I mean, there's humans as well. The confrontation is can we squeeze through here? I think. Well,
Yeah?
I mean,
You go here?
well, if you can squeeze through, that's
I mean, it is people just sit at the grass.
grass makes us no benches. No benches. Such an obvious thing to do, man. Just one last question. I know. Simplifying it, you both talk to machines, and the expression is, at least to some degree, machine language. So I wonder how, as a researcher, you cope with talking to a machine rather than, I guess, talking to humans. And what does machine language do in urban research? That is good, bad, odd, complicated, and so on. It's an odd question, but
Yeah. So the thing about machine is it's really straightforward. It does what you ask them to do. In a sense that, for me, I'm using two kind of programming language, which is Python and R. And this is the kind of things that I teach as well to my students at King's College London, in which they are a geographer, but then they could graduate with what it's called the spatial data science pathway. So essentially what we're trying to achieve is that in doing research or doing work, and it could be related to urban work or any kind of work, we can leverage machine and programming language as a tool to be able to help us do it could be like the data cleaning, data processing, data analysis, visualization, and so on. And the role of the machine, the role of the tool, the programming languages, is actually to make it easier for us to be able to tackle, for example, the data that might be really big, in which if we try to use it, if we try to do any computation manually, it's not going to be able to. We won't be able to do any kind of analysis, basically. And so I would identify myself either as in urban analytics or spatial data science, and both roles require this use of machine, computational language, programming language, and in order to help me make sense of the vast amounts of data that is available out there. And it could be that I'm using data from the government data set, but it's quite huge. It could be I'm using a crowdsourced data, satellite imagery, or data from sensors. Now we have access to all this kind of data, and in order to help us to understand, for example, urban phenomena, it is essential that we are using the right tool. In my case, this right tool could be the use of the programming languages, could be the use of softwares that could help us do some sort of like spatial analysis and so on. So I just like to emphasize that it is a tool, and it could be leveraged using what we need. And yeah, it's for me personally, talking to a machine is a process that I quite enjoy, because yes, when there's an error, they spit out an error. When we do need to do anything, they do exactly what we tell us to do.
nice. I like it. Awesome. Can we go to you, Mike?
You know, I first got involved in computers by writing computer programs, as I was said. So computer programs in the mid-'60s when I was a grad student, where, basically there was ALGOL, which is a procedural language, Atlas Autocode. This was very close to the machine in the sense that whenever we wrote a program, we would write it on punch tape, 7-hole punch tape, punch it out. If you made a mistake, you had to splice the tape and take out the code and then stick it back, okay, with the program typed in that way. Or if it was punch cards, you'd do the same. You'd take out the card and redo it. And then you would take the program that you'd written to the machine. And you wouldn't feed it in. There would be an army of operators dressed in white coats who would feed it into the mainframe machine, and 24 hours later you'd get the output. And the notion of us speaking to the machine was really just not on the agenda. I mean, there was an army of people who would build and service these mainframe computers in that sense. And then obviously as the mainframe miniaturized to the desktop, then programming became a bit more explicit for the ordinary person, basically, and ultimately people would mess around with the operating system and so on. So computer languages any programming language is like any other, basically. It's just a different dialect, really, in some sense. It's the same stuff underneath. And in that context, I don't think we speak to the machine, but we do enable the machine to do what we want using some kind of language, which is programming. And programming, I always thought, is quite close to the basic model or idea. So I was taught programming on the basis of how you add, numbers together and how you multiply them together, how you do maths, basically, in some sense. Now, programming is much more than that now. A lot of it is to do with moving large databases around.
Yeah. Add AI and ChatGPT into the bucket.
Yeah.
Does the story change of talking to the machine and the language of the machine?
It depends on who's talking to the machine. If you have somebody who isn't a programmer, and they talk to the machine like we interact with the desktop, like we load an app and we do things, that's very different from writing the app itself or writing the program in that sense. So at one level, if you use ChatGPT, all it is an elaborate search engine like Google that elaborates the text which you would get from Google into a kind of storybook fashion. It does a little bit more than that because it actually pronounces what ChatGPT thinks is right or wrong. And it's quite clear there's lots of examples of ChatGPT that get it badly wrong, basically, but they get it largely right because it's going off to this massive database which Google have constructed over the last 20 years, and other companies too, like Amazon and so on. And it searches that database to produce a story about what you're asking it to do. That's so we don't sit down.
Yeah, I'll sit you down for the last one, because I've walked, this is a whole exercise. Sit up. What do you think, Zara, just a minute on that question? Does it change?
When you add the picture into the equation, well, it could become a whole new podcast, right?
Yep.
But if we think about AI, for example, if I'm taking an example of ChatGPT, so ChatGPT is a generative artificial intelligence. And what it does, if we try to look at how it works, it's, for example, it's using this natural language processing or whatever it is inside the ChatGPT to find, for example, if you have a word and find like another word that is closer to it, like that has the closest relationship to it. It keeps doing that, as Mike would say, until it builds a story. So again, if we look into it, it's a whole process, but it still doesn't have a mind on its own. So then ChatGPT, people can use it as a tool. For example, they're going to learn Google Earth Engine. They ask ChatGPT, which code should I use? They will spit out the code. It might be correct. It might not be correct. And it depends on how you use it. It still depends on the human that are using that, right? And so even if you add the question about AI, I think AI is still a tool. And yes, it really depends on who's using it, for what, on how, and I know that it keeps on progressing, and we just need to be on top of it as well. As, for example, in urban informatics, urban analytics, to be able to leverage it as a tool that we can use to help us reach our goal.
So we're back in the studio, and something we've been doing before we wrap up all of our episodes is asking our guests to tell us about the significant places that have shaped their research or their role as an academic or their career trajectories. And here's Mike, who takes us to the land of the buffalo wing.
I've worked in a lot of different places. Manchester, Reading, then Cardiff. And then in the late 80s, I was head of the department in Cardiff, and I couldn't stand it, frankly. And basically, I got this offer, this job at Buffalo, directing the NCPIA. And so I went to SUNY Buffalo for 5 years, and that was a great experience. I mean, I love North America, and this was the Rust Belt of North America, but it was a very easy place to live. The climate was fairly extreme in Buffalo. It's the snow capital of the United States. But it was a very attractive and easy place to live, and it was quite relative to Britain, I think. It was reasonably wealthy in many senses. At least the housing was cheap, basically, and it was easy to get to travel internationally from Buffalo in that sense. But the critical issue in terms of why I recommend that place is because the people there were very interesting. There was a group of people, one in the department, and who were specialised in an area that I'd worked on with Paul Omni called fractals. We did a lot of work on fractal geometry. And there were a lot of people there who'd worked on this kind of thing. Of course, the other thing was at Buffalo, I actually learned my GIS because it was really a GIS centre. And so I was thrust into the middle of all these people who were internationally known in terms of GIS in that sense. So it was a very rapid and quite pleasant sort of upbringing at that level. And I'd say I like the place and I like the people in that sense. So a lot of people would think, oh my God, Buffalo, it's sort of Rust Belt, it's cold in the winter and hot in the summer and so on. But I got a lot from it. I thought it was a great place.
Is there anywhere in Buffalo a library, a pub?
Well, of course, Buffalo is the capital of buffalo wings. There is a place called the downtown where basically after one of the football games, a bunch of guys came in and demanded to be fed at 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night. And all they had in the kitchens were buffalo wings, basically, from the chicken that they'd been frying earlier on in the restaurant. And so they threw these into a frying pan, and hence buffalo wings was invented. And there were quite a few bars around Buffalo. Rutti's, I remember, on the North Campus was a great place, I like the idea of getting a pitcher of beer and a bunch of guys around. And those are the places. There was Rutti's and there was Duff's, basically. Those two were near the North Campus, basically. One was near the South Campus. But so yeah, from that point of view, it was great.
This podcast does not receive any funding from Buffalo Wings. It's perfect. Yeah. Is there anything that came to mind?
Yeah. Yes, because my research focus, you might say that it focuses on the UK, and the next one would be Indonesia. So Indonesia is the country where I'm from, and I just came back from Indonesia 3 days ago. We went to different cities in Indonesia. And so lots of my research also now focus on kind of like the digital aspect, including Indonesia and Bangladesh. Specifically in Indonesia, I think I would take you to a specific city. It's called Bandung. So it's around 2 hours away from Jakarta, the capital city. It's the home of ITB, Institute of Technology Bandung, in which I studied my undergrad degree. And it's just, as a city, it's quite a unique city. It sits on top of, what do you call it? They're surrounded by mountains, and it sits right there. And it's a home for me. And so researching about it is also takes lots of like sentimental values and elements and emotions. So yeah, I think if I have to take you anywhere in the world, I'll take you to Bandung.
Do you take me anywhere? Is there rotis with pitchers of beers, or is there anywhere like specific in Bandung that you'd go?
I would go. So there is the road. It's a stretch of road called Dago, and it's in north of Bandung. It's and if you go towards the very north, then you'll find lots of different places in which you can get a coffee, you can get your light bites. But then the view is quite nice. You have the pine trees, you have, and it's all quite green. And there are lots of different kind of like restaurants that is locally owned. And I quite like kind of like going through the road throughout all these different local restaurants. And they have amazing food. And food always speaks to me.
You see, there's a connection to Buffalo Green.
Yes.
I think that's all that I need.
So it was so fascinating to hear from Zara and Mike about this 60-year timeline covering both of their careers in urban spatial analytics. And what I found really interesting was this common interest in mapping and identifying patterns in the platform economy and the way that impacts cities. Mm. But really about the different ways that they've done programming and the way that the programming of urban data has evolved over time. Hearing Mike describe the very tactile punching holes in paper and human beings feeding it in and then waiting for 24 hours to get your result, compared to this idea that you can talk to the machine and the machine will do what you tell it, and you can get almost instant results that tell you can move data around very easily, and you can kind of map these processes almost instantaneously. Was really fascinating to hear just how far that field has come, and from Zara and Mike. And then I thought that there were some really interesting things that they both said emerging from their research about the urban, and this idea from Mike that predictive models in a post-COVID world are the grip, or the idea that we can be very predictive about forecasting patterns in urban life has really loosened since COVID produced this really unexpected shock to cities across the globe. And just thinking through how then we plan things like infrastructure if we can't rely on forecasts to tell us how many people might ride the infrastructures that we're building, or how much return on investment we might expect to receive over the horizon of building and implementing infrastructure. And I just think that this raises some really interesting questions about the future of cities and infrastructures and housing and places. And the second thing that really struck me from what we heard today was Zara's point about Airbnb misuse in London, or all of the research that she's been doing on this topic, and how the overall percentage of homes or households in London where Airbnb misuse is being reported is quite small compared to the actual number of households in London. But when you begin to use urban spatial analytics and mapping to really identify where Airbnb misuse is occurring, you see these real concentrations in areas that are already rapidly gentrifying. And it just strikes home to me, who doesn't know much about urban spatial analytics, just how critical this field is for identifying the impacts of the platform economy on cities in the way that they do. And those were some of my key takeaways from everything that we heard across this extremely fascinating conversation. And everybody who listens to this podcast will come away with different things. So I'm really curious to hear what you thought.
Yeah, I really liked, in a sense, the frankness of their engagement with what from the outside I imagine to be a highly technological and super precise space, and instead sort of this complexity, both science and tools that need tweaking, they are imperfect, they create abuses and intentionalities. I really loved their reflection on talking to the machine, and in fact sort of dispelling a bit of the myth that talking to the machine is complicated, and the shift from the tactile to the intangible in many ways. And for those of you that are listening, something super tactile is Caitlin's buckets of stacks and stacks of notes here that we're shuffling around. But
I tried to come prepared, Michele, okay?
Yeah, so we're not as technical as Zara and Mike. We have about 4 computers open and 16 different packets of papers. But in many ways, sort of that also reminds me of how they're balancing such a complicated dance with the urban, and in a way, going back to our original Walking the City and global urbanism theme, how the global urbanism of platform urbanism sort of hits the roads and becomes tangible spatial data. And with that, I think we've had a really packed one. We've attempted something we didn't do before, but working two people. Sort of worked, sort of didn't. It'll be up to you, but we've had tons of fun with that. So with that, Zara Shabrina and Mike Batty on complexity, on platforms, on predictions, with a snippet of the joint work. There's plenty more of that where it came from. So if you want to read or hear more, jump into our show notes with some links, with more of their work blog posted for you to dive into. And I swear that in this case, this is very safe and you won't risk any bike lanes in the middle of that pathway to more knowledge. And until the next adventure, thank you from us. Thank you for listening. Thanks for walking the city with us, with Zara and with Mike. Walking the City With is a mini-series by the Urban Studies Journal with the University of Bristol and the University of Melbourne, produced by Caitlin Morrissey in Manchester, Julia Macbeth in Glasgow, Kate Murray in Melbourne, and myself, Michele Acuto, in Bristol. Thank you for listening.